Paulo Henrique Araújo, is Flávio Bolsonaro going to defend Brazil in the United States, my friend?
That's right, Shimon. So we have some updates on that because we have a public hearing that will be held at the Capitol here in Congress on July 6th. And on that day, issues involving Section 301, the 301 ordinance, will be discussed, which could lead to Brazil being taxed an extra 25%. And what's drawing attention is exactly that, because it's a hearing that anyone can sign up for. Sign up, right? If they have some connection to the case, obviously, and speak, defend arguments, present, and explain. And the Brazilian government, it did nothing, absolutely nothing, the government of Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva. And now we have the information that Flávio Bolsonaro, a senator of the Republic, will come here to Washington and will indeed do this work, right, of publicly defending there before the American Congress. And the preliminary information we've already managed to gather is that he will defend the position that Brazil should not be taxed. And this has already caused some tremors, right, within Itamaraty, because they see this as interference by the opposition in Brazil's international relations affairs. But what kind of coordination is Lula's government doing about this? What we have, at least publicly, is that only the president of Brazil, right, Luiz Inácio, he attacks President Trump all the time, turns the issue into a sovereignty dispute, and the negotiation, which is what really matters, is not being made public. If it's happening, nobody knows about it, Shimon Oliveira. So now we have this confirmation of Flávio Bolsonaro going down this path.
Paulo seems to, parece. Here's some behind-the-scenes information from yesterday from the United States. That Joesley Batista, a friend of Lula, who was actually the one who arranged for Lula to be received by Trump. Back then, it seems he lost his influence there because Trump really broke off relations with Lula. And it was on purpose because he said that in an interview, right? He said that Lula is volatile, right? He said that Lula is insignificant, right? To put it simply, on television, publicly. So what can we understand from this? Look at the move, right, from the opposition. It seems like the opposition is waking up, aside from the internal fights here in Brazil, which we can't let continue. Of course, we're not going to get into details here, this public airing of the right's dirty laundry. But yeah, aside from that, it seems like they've woken up because it's a huge opportunity since Lula has been weakened with the Trump administration, and he's weakened, folks. It's undeniable. It doesn't matter what Lula says. He got weaker because Trump turned the tables. Did you notice that? Before Bolsonaro's arrest, before the Magnitsky law involving Moraes, which happened last year, Trump used to criticize Lula harshly on social media. You remember that, right? It wasn't just Trump, Marco Rubio too, the U.S. Treasury Department as well, and also the U.S. Embassy in Brazil. Yeah, they were poking at Moraes, poking at Lula. Well, Lula managed to make a deal with Trump. Immediately, all hostilities from Trump and his team against the Brazilian government stopped. It stopped. Trump never said anything again, quite the opposite. He had even praised Lula in public. Well, then comes the G7, and that's when everything changes. Actually, the change starts with Flávio Bolsonaro's visit. And then we talked here, Paulo, about this change that's happening in the Americas and about Lula's lack of action in supporting this project by Donald Trump and the United States. The relationship there really soured for good. Flávio goes to the United States. A photo of Flávio comes out. All of that comes to light, right? Then comes the G7, Trump ignores Lula. Lula makes a ridiculous scene. And then comes the bombshell. Trump starts criticizing Lula, criticizing Brazil, criticizing the actions of the Supreme Court and the federal government. So, definitely, Paulo, for you who are right there in the halls of the White House, it seems like the relationship between Trump and the Brazilian left has really soured for good.
Yes, and you brought up some important points. Let's try to connect the dots here, Shimon Oliveira. I'll start with Trump's statement, right? He said the following: I saw Brazil, the leader whom I don't know very well. He's a very volatile person. This is easy for us to understand. Why? He comes, goes to talk and so on, talks to Trump. And Trump, well, they had good chemistry. The guy seems to me to be an interesting person. Then he leaves the meeting and starts talking a bunch of nonsense. He insults Trump, insults people from the administration, offends Marco Rubio. Trump must look and say, he's crazy. That's what volatility is. It's a person who's different every time. That's why Trump is calling Lula crazy, right? Like, man, the guy talks to me one way, then he goes and completely changes. It's hard not to understand that.
Left wing? I've never been left wing.
Look, I've never been left wing, right? And then there's the second part here of what Trump said, right? I don't think about him, to be honest with you. I really don't think about him. I couldn't care less, but he's a different kind of person. Now, very volatile. I heard him giving a speech. It was very volatile, and that's okay. So, like, it's something everyone talks about, the speeches that Lula gives. He thinks he's in trade back in the 2000s. Back then, you had to download the video, go to a program, someone would subtitle it by hand, send an email, upload it to Rapid Share so you could download the video. It doesn't work like that anymore, right? For whom? Now I've revealed my age, right? Rapid Share. But anyway. But like Shimon Oliveira, we can see here that things really arrive in minutes. That's right. It's getting worse quickly. And what happens?
About Lula's visit to Washington, where he left with that face like he ate something he didn't like. Show it. Production, Lula's face from that meeting. Trump's statement now. How long ago was that, Paulo? 2 months? Maybe not even that.
A month and a half, man. A month and 20 days, a month and a half. So what was it? A month and a half, exactly that. So what happens, Shimon Oliveira? There are other factors here which you mentioned about Joesley Batista. Let's go. This is a point that I follow very closely here in the United States. There is a big concern in the American Midwest among cattle ranchers, right? The cattle people, as they call them here. And what happens? JBS and National Beef are two Brazilian companies that have a huge lobbying presence inside the United States of America. But even within the Trump administration itself, there are divisions as well. I always talk a lot about this. And there are some sectors that are more aware of who JBS is. And the information I was able to gather around here is the following: that JBS was kind of shielded regarding these issues together with President Donald Trump. And then after Flávio Bolsonaro's visit, Trump started to receive more information about JBS, mainly coming from the United States Department of Agriculture. And then he started to get more information, not only about the cattle dispute issue here in the United States, because whether we like it or not, it's a complicated situation. JBS within the United States is responsible for generating around 30,000 jobs. That's substantial. That's very substantial. And the Batista family made several large contributions here to President Trump, just like they did in the past for the Democrats, because that's the game, that's lobbying, okay? But they've also already paid million-dollar fines, like with Chicago. So when we look at the total amount of fines they've paid here, it gets close to $1 billion. Man, wow. Yeah, it's a lot. Sorry, a billion reais. Sorry, Shimon, a billion reais. It's a lot. Either way, it's a lot. And why is that? In the American justice system, it's like this. You're being sued. If you agree to pay the fine, it's because you want to close the matter. You admitted guilt. Here it is. Look, done. I paid. I solved it. Let's save time in court. Everything's fine. And this has been happening for 10 years here in the United States. And more than that, President Trump was reportedly briefed that JBS is a kind of chaebol in Brazil. For those who don't know, Geza is a company linked to the Cuban Communist Party, which controls various sectors of society. And in fact, it's something we really need to pay close attention to regarding what's happening with JBS and their power, which keeps growing in various areas within Brazil, using the state apparatus and public money. So this caused Joesley Batista to start losing some of the direct influence he had with President Donald Trump. But Lula's actions on several fronts, not only in the direct relationship between the two presidents, but also in the bilateral relationship between the two countries. This caused that power, that access Lula had managed to build, to fragment and decrease a lot. Does that mean it can't change? Not necessarily. We know how it works, right? Geopolitics is not linear. That's one of my mottos. However, my friend, when, as you rightly pointed out, the President of the United States comes on television, and I'll play it here again. Look, I don't think about him, to be honest with you. I really don't think about him. I couldn't care less.
That's the worst.
That's bad. That's the worst. Because it's bad for Brazil. Brazil, sometimes we get stuck, right? And that's normal in this situation. Lula is a scoundrel and so on, etc. He's getting screwed. I'm happy. But Brazil loses a lot because of this, because Brazil is the second largest country in the Americas. We're only behind the United States. We're ahead of Canada, Mexico, Argentina. But what's the problem? We're way behind and we're losing relevance, and we're going to lose this position if things keep going this way. Yeah, we're entering the darkness of the Americas. Paulo,
For us to keep this second place, we need to have a strong alliance with the United States because China can't make up for this difference. China can't beat its chest today and say, "No, break with the United States and everything you lose from the Americans, we'll make up for it." Not at all, folks. First, China doesn't have the economic muscle. It doesn't have the structure to consume what Brazil produces, what the Americans consume. And it doesn't have the slightest ability to maintain stability here in the region. China is just a parasite that sucks up whatever it can to take back there and feed itself. They have millions, billions of mouths to feed. Do you think they're worried about Brazilians, right? Not that Americans care much more either, but our relationship with them is already stable. But coming back here, Paulo,
no, let me comment. This point you mentioned, Wade Shimon, is very important. No, let me say something. What you brought up here is extremely important because here's the thing. You opened the door, Shimon Oliveira. Let me jump in for God's sake. Look, what do we have here? It's not that the concern is the same or not. The way both countries understand a partnership is completely different. And here's the interesting point, Perfect, that many people don't notice. What's the issue? How does China operate? It's extractivism. China practices extractivist imperialism, okay? It's very similar to what, for example, countries like Belgium or the British Empire itself did in Africa. And it's different, for example, from how the Portuguese acted in relation to Brazil. Many people think it's extractivism, but that's not how it works. I'll explain. China, everything they do is always thinking solely and exclusively about the advantages and benefits the Chinese will get. They don't invest in other countries, and when they do, they have to have total control. We're seeing the case of BYD in Camaçari, Bahia, and Midas, something that's happening now in Minas Gerais. Paulo,
yesterday they are a practical example of what you're talking about now from China. Yesterday, a video came out of some PT Union members at BYD. They're at the construction site. Why? The Chinese are whipping themselves.
the Chinese are,
Whipping the people from Bahia, man.
but this is a serious problem. And I'll tell you, Shimon Oliveira, why?
Because that's how it is in China. In China, a guy gets beaten up if he's lazy, if he doesn't work.
I also have material here about Africans who suffer physical punishment from Chinese people, but there the Africans aren't doing anything. And this is a very serious problem. Why? That's what I'm saying. China is an empire, an extractive imperialist power.
It has to produce.
Yes, they will do it. It has to produce, it has to be for them, and the benefits have to be for them. And when you have a partnership like this, what happens? They will put a lot of money into the hands of various sectors, for example, agriculture. But where does the problem go after that? Because this will always end up enslaving Brazil. And we have Chinese debt diplomacy, which is a Chinese geopolitical strategy where you use this long-term strategy. In other words, they bring in a lot of money, grease the palms of certain elites, but then they tie up the administration. The government changes, but the contracts remain. And that's exactly what Lula is doing now. For example, selling public debt bonds in this.
What's the worst news?
And what's the difference with the United States at this point? And here we have to see who is the best partner for us to have. That's the point, isn't it? That's because there's a very strong anti-American sentiment projected in Brazil, which comes from this communist educational indoctrination we've had in Brazil since the 1970s. That keeps instilling this anti-American sentiment, this anti-American hatred. But how do Americans operate? Hey, are you my partner? All right. So I'm going to take you up with me. And then what do we see in the Shield of the Americas? I'll take, for example, Paraguay. I think I've already mentioned this to you before, but it's worth bringing up as an example. Look, Paraguay made a very good bilateral agreement within the Shield of the Americas with the United States. What are they doing? The United States is going to buy the surplus energy from Itaipu. Did they ask for a discount? No. They'll pay what Paraguay requested. Period. Second point. Look, we have a very serious organized crime problem in Paraguay. And for me to invest in your country, I need to be sure that this investment won't go down the drain later. Shall we work to clean things up, get rid of organized crime, and make it a prosperous environment? Let's do it. So, are you going to label PCC as terrorists? Okay, Comando Vermelho, Hezbollah, everyone who's operating on your border. Let's do it. Can I send my troops to help out there? Shall we establish a bilateral agreement for that? Let's do it. Troops came, right? American troops went to Paraguay. What else is the United States going to do? They're going to invest in local data centers to take advantage of Itaipu's energy with the private sector. That's the difference. It's not American state money like the Chinese do. Yeah, the private sector. Okay, what else are you going to do? We're going to develop skills among the Paraguayan people. What does China do? They import workers to whip Brazilians. Yeah, that's not possible. And what are the United States doing? They're going to make long-term investments for 10, 20 years, and the Paraguayans are going to become a technology elite, my friend. We will have programmers, software engineers, hardware engineers, etc. All of this happening inside Paraguay.
No, it's impressive. And the difference, guys, the difference is, look, it's the interests of the United States. The difference lies in the interests, because American interests, even though they're meant to supply over there, American companies end up benefiting those who participate, right? It's not just in Paraguay, right? You have Costa Rica there, you have several Latin countries that are part of a much bigger alliance with the United States. The quality of life is completely different because the local society ends up being benefited by these commercial relationships. And more importantly, guys, Paulo said it well, right? The difference is that these are private companies from the United States that need legal security in the country, meaning they have to fight crime, fight corruption, and all that, right? Yeah, China is state-owned money. China has now set up in Mato Grosso the largest soybean processor in Brazil, maybe even in Latin America. In Mato Grosso. First you say it's a Chinese private company, but it's actually state-owned. How does a country, pay attention, how does a country control the biggest soybean processor inside our Brazil? How? Do you understand? It's not a private company that can be sued, that can even be kicked out of the country without having to start a war, in case it has practices like enslaving workers, right? Among other things. No, man, you're dealing with the government, you're dealing with the Chinese state. And when you're dealing with a predatory state like China, the conversation doesn't happen in the courts, guys. You get it? The Chinese, they've learned to deal with force, with brute strength. What are they doing in the Pacific? Stealing. They steal fish. You, Paulo, dealing with fish thieves is the lowest level a human being can get to. Stealing fish is what China does, guys, on a global scale. They are fish thieves. Paulo, but so we don't change the subject?
Let me just add to this about the grain hub. It's a quick tweet. Shimon Oliveira, it's a quick tweet, my friend. And what did they do before? They took control of a good part of the ports, of the main Brazilian ports, Paraná, São Paulo, Espírito Santo, and up in Maranhão. Who controls the grain processing center at the port of Santos today? The Chinese. China. Not to mention that around 20% of the energy in Brazil as well, okay? 20% of the energy today is in the hands of the Chinese. It's a ticking time bomb, my friends.
The Chinese and Joesley Batista, huh? The Chinese and Joesley Batista up in the north of Brazil buying thermoelectric and hydroelectric plants. They bought them, right? They entered a certain bidding process and took everything, and with the subsidy from the federal government, which we are going to pay for. Okay, folks? The whole of Brazil is going to pay the bill for those plants up in the north of Brazil. But why does a guy in Paraná have to pay that bill? That's the Lula government. The government, I had got back to it. I didn't lose the thread, okay? I didn't lose the cue from Trump's speech, okay? Because Trump says that Brazil has never been more insignificant. The production team is going to put that translated speech here for us. Yeah, and then at the moment Trump makes that statement, in other words, breaking ties with Lula, Flávio Bolsonaro came in there. Well, the Lula government isn't interested in defending Brazil. Justify there why these tariffs shouldn't be applied in Brazil. Well, I'll go there. And Flávio Bolsonaro then will present himself before the United States Congress, before this committee that deals with tariffs on other countries, and will try to save Brazil from these tariffs. Literally, that's quite a promotion. If he actually manages to do it, as a Brazilian, I really hope he does. Because it's already hard for us, the economy, even without this tariff. Imagine with the tariff, right? If he manages to do that, look, that's quite a gift he'll get for the elections, because it really shows relevance and an ability to negotiate. It's not that Lula can't have it, folks. He just doesn't want to, because he wants to break once and for all with the United States, Paulo. That's my impression. I have the impression, and that's just my impression, okay, folks, that Lula, the PT, they need to break with the United States once and for all so they can consolidate themselves here in the Americas. Because this ended up becoming even the last stronghold of the PT, right? In a moment, we'll talk about the election in Colombia. I want Paulo to comment on the election in Colombia as well. In Peru, it seems like there's no turning back anymore, right? The latest data showed that. But just so we can move forward with our agenda here, Paulo. Trump made that statement, said that was there anything else about the elections? Is Trump going to get involved in the elections in Brazil? Paulo, I have the impression that all of this that's happening is already a way of getting involved in Brazil's elections. That's the impression I get.
Well, and here we have to understand, Shimon, what kind of interference we're dealing with, right? There's campaign propaganda like what Lula has been doing, and he talks about electoral interference as if the United States of America were manipulating the elections in Brazil and things like that. I don't see things going that way, especially from what I've been following about what the United States has been doing since the Trump administration returned. Unlike what the Biden administration did in Brazil with the issue involving the instrumentalization of USAID. And here, I won't go into too much detail, but for those who want to understand more, it's just the use of an external structure they already had, namely the one from George Soros's shadow party. I've written a book on this topic, okay, Shimon Oliveira. In fact, it was my first book, The United States and the Shadow Party. Let's leave it at that. They just brought it into the government apparatus and changed what was the clear objective of USAID with its manipulation and infrastructure structure. Let's put it this way, electoral, so that public opinion would be moved toward their objective. That's how Obama was elected, Biden, etc. In this book, I give all these details. So that's not the path we're going to see right now, but what has President Trump been doing? He has used the influence of being the president of the United States and promises of closer relations. And what does a large part of the Latin American population want? The American dream. What is the American dream? Well, I have a good job. I gained some freedom. I managed to start a business. And whenever I want, I can travel to the United States. That's the American dream, right? And here, the American dream is even in the sense of the whole continent, right? To broaden it for us. And President Trump, he then publishes an article on Truth Social from Newsmax, which is kind of like Global News here in the United States. It's a news channel. It's not that their agenda is the same. They're more to the right. And about that publication, it talks about the electoral victories that President Trump supported. Out of 8 candidates he backed on the continent, 7 won. And there's an interesting point mentioned there precisely about Brazil. And it says that the next big challenge he has is Brazil. and that Brazil will be a real test for President Trump, and it talks about the weakening that Lula has been experiencing. Well, Trump published this, and of course, the headline is very interesting. It's really, really interesting. Trump's victories in Latin America. However, he definitely saw that a significant part of the article talks about the clashes he has been having. Along with the interesting part, definitely interesting, but also, and more than that, the interesting thing, Latin America victories, but the challenge. And more than that, taking a cue from the fact that Flávio Bolsonaro is coming here on the 6th, what does that show? That he is also looking one step ahead. And his victories in Latin America, definitely interesting Latin America, but those victories in Latin America, for sure, he saw this clash happening because Lula, he is making things very problematic, but then victories in Latin America, and then he mentioned it there, he said it was interesting, definitely in Latin America, victories, and interesting, definitely, he complicated things from the perspective we have for the future of Brazilian international relations. But if Lula leaves, there are some things he left behind that won't be easy to undo. Energy dependencies, yes, public debt bonds sold to the Chinese state practically in yuan. But he didn't necessarily sell it to the Chinese state, more or less because China controls the yuan. And depending on how much the currency devalues, this can directly impact the Brazilian economy. It's different from selling debt securities in euros, as has already been done, or in dollars, because the euro has always been a stronger currency than the dollar, right, from the point of view of purchasing power. So that doesn't put it at risk. Now, the yuan comes from a volatile economy, just like Lula, according to Trump, and even more than that. Besides being a volatile economy, it's also an artificial economy where we don't have real indicators. And the suspicion is that China is heading toward a very serious economic recession, which may already be happening. But since the government is always manipulating the economic indicators, we don't have a clear view of what's really happening. Shimon Oliveira. So it's a complex situation that we have here.
There are no rules, right, in China. They don't have rules. The party is the one who makes them. Even here in Brazil, which is a mess, you have a system of rules, you have a certain market transparency, right? As much as they try to doctor the IBG's extremely important data, there is some opposition, there's still a little bit of journalism, right? And we have this data. But look, the more Lula entrenches himself, the less legal security we have. Notice that international money is leaving Brazil, guys. The average Brazilian, the regular Brazilian, Paulo, doesn't really have that. This awareness is growing a little, but he isn't very aware because he doesn't deal with dollars. He doesn't have investments, right? The guy can barely make ends meet each month to do his shopping. Even less likely is that he'll have some savings in dollars or investments. But those who do start to notice, guys, that the money is leaving, the industries are shutting down. Look, another car factory has closed in Brazil. Another one. Well, if Brazil were a paradise, factories would want to set up in Brazil, not leave Brazil. Look who came to Brazil, BYD. But why is BYD able to set up in Brazil while Ford, right, while other brands like BMW and Mercedes are closing? Yeah.
Chevrolet,
Renault. Why? Because, man, this is a harsh place. BYD can do it because they have party money. They have state money invested in them. And that's exactly the goal. I put out a cheaper car. I put out a car that's cheaper than all the others on the market, which are being swallowed up by taxes, right? I make a subsidy deal with the government. In other words, I come in with better conditions. I get financial support from the Chinese government to produce. I deliver a cheaper car, paid for with our own money, which they take from here. But since my car is cheaper, I'm going to wipe out the competition. I wipe out the competition, I dominate the sector, I control the whole society, and I control the prices. And then a monopoly came to exist. This is the modus operandi that China has been applying, even in Europe, right? Which lost. Europe lost. Right? The big European automakers are melting down because of the competition with Chinese cars, Paulo. I feel like you're going to drop a bomb.
Exactly. No, and there's another factor in this that's extremely important. Since Brazil is always behind in everything, right? It's in the sense of keeping up with what's happening in the world. Why? Besides everything you said, which is absolutely right about Brazil, Shimon, we have a worrying situation, which is that China doesn't develop the local economy. They bring their own workers, and more than that, these workers will operate within Brazil according to Chinese labor laws. What are those? None. It's 7-0. Meanwhile, here in Brazil, industries and factories have to follow the rules. No, now the 6-1 is over. It's 5-2, a bunch of rules. We saw what happened with Orto Ortobon just now, right? That bizarre thing. Meanwhile, the Chinese do whatever they want. They even whip the workers, Brazilians. So it's something extremely worrying. What did we see? We can look at it from that side too. No, the union leader, right, who got whipped there, we can laugh for 10 seconds, but from a social perspective, what will happen? The guy who's a union leader from CUT, the Unified Workers Central, etc., will say, wait a minute. There will come a point when he'll say, the guy who's putting these people here is a man who used to say he was a union leader just like us. This guy is a traitor. So that's how it is. And when this bomb goes off, right, that's when we Brazilians need to have maturity. Because many will think like this, well, that's it. Let them get screwed now. Let them pay for what they did, etc. From a revenge standpoint, I can't blame people for thinking that way. It's natural. But when we look deeper, we'll see that this will become a movement that will show the big problem with the left, the labor discourse, and the hypocrisy in practice. Because one thing is a guy promising steak and not having it. Another thing is the union leader who got there by bringing in those who whip the workers. And that's what I believe the Brazilian population has a chance to reorganize itself, the opinion makers, the political class, and say, see, these guys were never on your side, right? The ones on your side are those who want to promote private enterprise. They want you to have more freedom. They want your little shirts from Shein to come without taxation. So you can have your small business. They don't want to make a union for delivery workers or Uber drivers. The ones doing that are the right wing. So now is the time, right, especially in an election year, to take advantage of this, Shimon. Not to be vengeful, right, and say, now you guys are on your own, etc. No, this is the time to be smart. And that's how the left has grown over the last 150 years in the world, by taking advantage of these moments of singularity. May we Brazilians have the intelligence for that. To wrap up about Europe, Shimon, this movement I mentioned where Brazil is always behind, right? When we see that European countries are starting to push back Chinese influence, starting to put in rules, strict market rules, setting limits in technology companies, which also includes electric cars and everything else. As for the issue of technology theft, right? Industrial espionage, which would be the correct term, right? Brazil is opening up. Europe is starting to pull away. So now Brazil, after a long time, you see the Chinese realize things are closing up in Europe. So let's go to Brazil then. So we have Lula there looking like a crab turned toward the sun, waiting for the Chinese to come, my friend.
And they come and take everything, folks. They leave nothing behind. But going back, we were talking about the elections, right? Trump's role, Trump's influence in the Americas, right? There were 8 candidates, 7 ended up getting elected. I can't say, Paulo, I don't know if you have the name there, who was the one that didn't make it, which country Trump wasn't able to get his candidate elected, but it's nearby actually, right?
Yes, it was in Central America, but now my memory is going to fail me, Shimon. Which one was it? But no problem. It was in Central America.
So, and now Brazil. And then comes the comment. That headline I told you about, Paulo, that I couldn't remember which one it was, that Trump had said is, now our attention will turn to the elections in Brazil. That's the headline that came out this week, right? I don't know where from. Yeah, I admit I don't know where from because I couldn't find the exact statement from Trump saying, exactly that. But the other statements, what was said at the G7, what was said in that interview, lead exactly to this moment. Now, the attention of the United States turns to the Brazilian elections, and what's there obviously is already kind of consolidated in Cuba, right? Which is also already taking on that kind of regime model. And then confirming Trump's arrival here in Latin America, Colombia just lost, right? On Sunday, we had the second round where the right wing won and Petro, desperate, accuses Israel of manipulating the magic boxes. Interesting, Paulo, because they're infallible, aren't they? The magic boxes of the electoral system are infallible. But now Colombia lost. Israel got into the magic box and made the Trump right wing guy win the elections, but they lost. And it's another sign for Lula. It's another sign of a trend. Because the modus operandi of the left, not only in Brazil but throughout Latin America, is exactly the same, including economically. Paulo, which is to weaken the industry, to weaken the purchasing power of the middle class, of the Brazilian worker. And the complaints in Colombia are the same as in Brazil. Look, we go to the supermarket and there's no way to take the products home, right? Yeah, so the economy is also failing. There's all this persecution of the opposition, all the revocation of freedoms, right? But the economy is also terrible.
Look, Shimon, we have a very important point here in what you're saying. Why? Let's go. There are several factors we need to discuss and what Colombia brings as a perspective for us. Last year, already at the end of last year, I always do future electoral planning, right? Over at Pega PH Vox, we're always covering elections around the world, and I've already been warning, giving tips, as we say in Portuguese, to the audience, which is the following. The future of Latin America will depend on 3 or 4 very important elections that we will have. Bolivia, Peru, Colombia, and Brazil. And the outcome of these elections will be very interesting for us Brazilians because Brazil has its last election in this cycle. And the results we would get from these other countries would indicate a lot about the direction Brazil is heading. But people might think, no, but hold on, PH. Brazilians aren't paying attention to what's happening in Bolivia. Brazilians aren't paying attention to what's happening in Peru. But it's not about Brazilians. It's about the fact that an election is won through various arrangements. And these various arrangements involve powerful groups within Brazil. And these power groups are going to look at the direction Latin America is heading in order to defend what? Their capital. In order to defend what? Their economic interests. An example we were talking about here, like the industries and so on. So we had Bolivia, not the right, but the center, right? The center one, but it's strongly aligned with the center right. That's what we have there in Bolivia. Because on the other side is the Sao Paulo Forum already trying to overthrow Bolivia's government. So, like it or not, even though Rodrigo Paz represents a centrist government, he fell into the arms of the right so they could survive. So Bolivia moved to the right. Peru, where Keiko Fujimori won, she will take office soon. And her family, just so we have an idea, had several problems with Alberto Fujimori, yes, but Fujimori took Peru out of a failed state. Just like Somalia was in the 80s and 90s trying to become a state capable of surviving, a country that survives. There are even images. What did Fujimori do? He distributed weapons to the population so they could defend themselves from the communist guerrillas, okay? There are videos of him in the 90s giving weapons to the people so they could defend themselves from the left. That's what we're talking about with the Fujimori family, okay? So you can expect a very strong, forceful government in Peru. Abelardo de las Priedia, he rose like a meteor in this election, right? Promising what? Really quickly, Keiko Fujimori talked a lot about capitalism for everyone, okay? This is important in her campaign. Abelardo de las Priedia, what did he talk about when he went up? Fighting organized crime, fighting international drug trafficking, fighting the economic destruction that the left caused in the country, and restoring good relations with Colombia's historical allies. And here there are 2 very important countries, Shimon, United States of America, and Israel. Coincidence or not, look at how Colombia's political situation is similar to the issues being discussed in Brazil: public security, organized crime, destruction of the economy, poor international relations with the United States and Israel. Similar, isn't it? That's right. And here's the invitation I always make whenever I go on a channel like this. Folks, understand that foreign policy is not the same as domestic policy. It's not a left or right game. Geopolitics is not linear. But we can observe the directions where all of this is heading. And the elections in Colombia, Bolivia, and Peru are showing those who have the power to influence a lot of things in Brazil, where the continent is heading. And Brazil, it's not isolated from the world. We have this perception partly due to the language barrier. Most of Brazil's population lives along the Atlantic coast. In most of Brazil, we don't talk much about the states that are more connected with Latin America, but that doesn't mean there aren't companies there, that there aren't investments, that we don't have a structure that goes inland, like the people in agribusiness. All of this will also influence this electoral perspective within Brazil. So this election we had in Colombia was the most important one on the continent this year, Shimon. And what did we see? Besides that, other partners of Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva and the São Paulo Forum losing elections in the Caribbean and Central America. And here I give a very clear example from Honduras. Xiomara Castro, she was the wife of Zelaya. Okay? Zelaya was the president who was deposed in 2009, 2010 in Honduras, and Lula gave him shelter inside the Brazilian embassy. He influenced the internal politics of Honduras at the time. Xiomara Castro comes back, right, as her husband's puppet to the presidency in 2022. And what was the first thing she did as soon as Lula was elected, okay? As soon as the election ended on the same day, she said, "Tomorrow I'm going to Brazil to seek investments for Honduras with the new president of Brazil." The day after the election, what did we see? We saw Alberto Fernandez from Argentina and Xiomara Castro here with a begging bowl in hand looking for money from our taxes. And now there won't be this movement, Shimon. We don't have this movement happening. And this involves the market. And how is Brazil going to end up in the middle of all this? We need to understand this beyond the field of political and electoral debate on social media. How will Brazilian industries look at collaborations across the entire continent? The companies that do business in Latin America, look, we're talking about Argentina, Paraguay, Bolivia, Chile, Peru, Colombia, Ecuador. Almost all our neighbors are on the right. And there are still countries like Guyana, for example, right, and Suriname, which have more left-leaning governments, but are aligned with the right, mainly with the United States. Why? Because Nicolas Maduro's dictatorship had a knife to their throat. Understanding this movement on the continent is very important so that Brazil, the Brazil that produces, can look at its path going forward. This election in Colombia was extremely important for us, Timo.
And then the actions and the pressure, and I say it's a really big pressure that the United States is putting on Lula right now, Paulo. I can see that. It's big, not small. Given even the current stance of the United States, which, whether people like it or not, has taken on a global leadership role. You have Europe kneeling, right? Yesterday we had a visit from the head of NATO. There, he's like a minister.
Hunt.
Yeah, exactly.
He's the Secretary General of NATO.
The Secretary General of NATO went to beg, literally, guys, he went to beg Trump not to pull the United States out of the North Atlantic Treaty Alliance, right? Yeah, and it seems kind of inevitable that at some point, Trump might not leave now, but the United States will eventually end up leaving this alliance, right? It's just like the UN, Paulo. Alliances that were established back then, during the Cold War, the UN right after World War II, they've kind of lost their effectiveness, right? Their goals in today's world, and they've become much weaker. But whether you like it or not, guys, I even stepped out here. Trump, he ended up bringing back that leadership that the Americans had lost. And today, everyone is looking at Trump. Everyone is looking at the United States to decide what will happen in the world. And it's no different with Lula. Now, all this pressure is being put on Lula, forcing Lula to make a decision regarding organized crime. Regarding these companies that are even, being accused by the American government of slave-like labor. And then this week, that report that came out there, that complaint that came out in Bahia, proved exactly what the United States was accusing. So the pressure is increasing, obviously, right? Not less important, the political and ideological stance, which also matters. It's not the first thing Trump looks at, but in the end, it does matter, right? That also ends up being some weight in the balance. Paolo, it looks like we're going to have some changes, right? It looks like we're going to have changes. Let's wait and see how Flávio Bolsonaro acts there in the United States.
Exactly, my friend. Look at that. What Flavio will have to work on the most is this. Calm down if I become president, right? He's a pre-candidate for the election. We're going to change things internally within Brazil. That's the point Flavio will have to work on really hard, my friend.
Very well. Paolo, you have your books, which I'll list all here so people can buy them, whether on Amazon, Mercado Livre. It'll be here, folks. Those are the three main ones. He has several books, but he has 2 or 3 main books that are really good, folks, to raise your level of consciousness. Tell us about them, Paulo, please.
Perfect, Shimon. Thank you very much. And yes, I have 5 books published. I picked out 3 here, right? So we can even talk about some interesting points. The first one is this one here, right? The United States and the Shadow Party, which I talked about if you want to understand USAID, right? People talk so much about USAID. But you can see that USAID was instrumentalized from within, and they corrupted something that was good, which was USAID. Read this book and you will understand much more deeply, including how Obama was brought to power and the hand of George Soros behind all of this. I wrote this book with my friend Ivan Kleber.
Are you tough on Obama? Obama is a tough subject, right? How did this guy come to power?
Well, this book is going to open the minds of a lot of people, especially for the 2020 election here in the United States. You know, the other book by Shimon Oliveira is this one here. It's a book that I have a lot of affection for, The Fall of Democracy in Brazil, right? The revolution that made our country and the world sick. It has a foreword by Flávio Gordon. I had the honor of having Flávio Gordon write the foreword for me. And it brings several deep thoughts that we have about what happened inside Brazil in recent years, especially since 2019. And there are also some correlations with what we have with the world. This book specifically is also available in English, right? In case someone is watching from outside Brazil. There's the English version, The Fall of Democracy in Brazil. You can find it there too. And this one here is my main work, right? This one is much bigger. The crown jewel. We're looking at it here. Foro de São Paulo and the Great Homeland, okay? Foro de São Paulo and the Great Homeland. With this book, you'll understand far beyond just the Foro de São Paulo, the ideological foundations of the leftist revolution in Latin America, right? Which go back even to the pre-communist period. And we can take a deep look at where the left is in Brazil. Because many times people only focus on the agenda, they're there supporting abortion and so on. But what's the origin of all this and how is this game played in Latin America? And since we Brazilians don't pay attention to what happens in Latin America, but what happens on the continent dictates Brazil's future, I highly recommend this book as well.
It's on the card, folks. It's in the description. It's on the card that appears here. You can click and get the book to enrich yourself. Hey, Paulo, look, you need to have an academy. We'll talk more about this later. You need to have an academy so you can teach. Guys, what do you think about learning these things from Paulo? Comment here. That way we can get some ideas. Now pay close attention to what I'm about to tell you. Every single day you ask me how I manage to master communication, face the system, and speak to millions of people. And with important people like Paulo, who we just talked to, how, Shimon, do you get these contacts? How do you break the barrier of 1 million views without relying on paid traffic or the goodwill of the algorithm? That's why I made a decision that will change your understanding of what social media is. I'm going to open the black box of my method. I'm going to open the doors of my own studio. In Curitiba, for an exclusive in-person immersion. It's not a pre-recorded course. It's not a lecture for a bunch of people. It's only 10 people. That's the number where we can answer all the questions. to serve and really share my knowledge in person. It's not through video, no. It's in person so you can perform on social media and monetize what you do, even in dollars. 10 spots for those who will sit at this same table with me to learn about scripting, retention, recording, and how to position yourself as an unshakable authority. There are 10 spots for those who will sit at this same table with me to learn hands-on about scripting, retention, and recording, and how to position yourself as an unshakable authority on YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, whatever the social network. If you want to stop being invisible online and turn your voice into an art, a weapon of influence, the QR code for our immersion is pulsing on your screen right now, or in the link that's in the first comment and in the video description. This could be your big turning point. And if you're tired of wasting time on Netflix or Amazon looking for a good movie or a good series to watch, I solved this problem for you. We created a channel with tips on series and good movies so you can just sit down and enjoy without having to spend hours searching and ending up with something terrible. Hey, the link is in the description, in the pinned comment, and in the card that appears on your video now. Now subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and like the video. It's a lot of work to bring Paulo Henrique Araujo here. So I hope you leave a like. Hey, shield your mind. I'm Shimon Oliveira, and I'll see you in the next video. See you then.